A stunning young explorer stumbles into an ancient tomb deep in New Mexico. But what begins as a routine dig quickly twists into a nightmare. She's thrust back over 1,000 years into a lost civilization of war, ritual, and terror. Hunted by a cursed figure with glowing green eyes and a skull-like face, she must survive deadly pursuits through jungle ruins and spirit-haunted lands. As empires clash and ancient armies rise, one warrior steps in to protect her. She's terrified, out of place, and being watched. Every step could be her last. This isn't just history, it's a trap, and time is running out. When I first flew to New Mexico, I wasn't looking for danger. My name's Ava, 25, freshly graduated from university in Boston, a quiet girl with a thing for ancient ruins and forgotten gods. The archaeology team was small, mostly grad students, but I stood out. Not for my knowledge, for my looks. Blonde hair, sharp cheekbones, and yeah, maybe that made me a magnet for attention. But none of that mattered when we found the stone arch. It wasn't on any map. Tucked deep in the cliffs, weathered but pulsing with this eerie glow when the sun hit it just right. I stepped closer, stupidly curious. The wind died, the world blinked, and I was gone. The heat hit first, thicker, heavier. I stood in a dense jungle clearing, surrounded by sounds I didn't recognize. The sky was raw, smoke in the distance, a drumbeat pounding like a heartbeat. I turned. Soldiers in feathered armor marched by, banners in the air, spears raised. One of them spotted me, a girl in leggings and a red socks hoodie. I ran. Branches clawed at my skin. Behind me, someone shouted, not in English. I kept moving until a hand yanked me down. He was young, maybe my age, dark skin, long braid. His name was Tivon, said I had no idea where I was. I didn't. It was year 430 before their sun god would fall, the peak of an empire I never learned about in class. We hid in a ruined shrine. That's when Tivon told me about the Red One. His real name was gone, just stories now. Burned face, skull-like grin, eyes like glowing emeralds. He'd come out only at night, they said, but not a spirit, something worse. Said he'd been cursed centuries ago, trapped between worlds, and he was hunting something. He found me that night. The jungle dropped into silence. Tevon was asleep. I wasn't. I felt it before I saw him, just outside, watching. Two glowing green eyes and a silhouette that didn't belong to any human. I didn't scream. I couldn't. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. He moved like smoke. Tivon grabbed my wrist. We ran again. We found a healer named Arima. She was old but knew the land. Said the Red One only chased those who didn't belong, that he could smell the time on me. She painted symbols on my arms, whispered in a tongue that made my skin crawl. Said I had until the next blood moon to return, or I'd become like him, trapped in time, not alive, not dead. There were only 5 days. We traveled east, through enemy lines. Rival tribes were preparing for war. Fires lit the sky every night. I saw things, rituals, shadows moving without bodies, people with eyes glazed like they'd seen too much. And still he followed, each night closer. I'd wake to hear him breathing outside our shelter. Arima fell ill. Tivon stayed strong. Said he'd protect me, no matter what. The last night, I saw his real face in the firelight. Fear. Not for himself, for me. Tomorrow, we try to reach the cave. The one with the arch, if it's still there.
I didn't sleep the night before. Every sound in the jungle echoed louder, longer. Tevin said we would reach the cave by midday. He tried to sound calm, but I could tell something had changed. We were being followed. I felt it when the birds stopped singing. The forest held its breath. Even Arima, barely able to walk, kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected something to crawl out from the shadows. The leaves rustled in a way that didn't feel natural, not like wind, like something watching us, waiting. We crossed a river. The water was cold, but I barely noticed. My heart was louder than the current. We moved fast, but I kept slipping on wet stones. Tevin stayed behind me, one hand always ready to catch. Arima pointed ahead. She said the mountain was sacred, where the sky touched the ground, the place where time could break again. We had to climb before the sun fell, or he would come. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. I already felt him. We reached a stone staircase, half buried in moss. It coiled up the cliff like a snake. Every step creaked with weight. I looked up and saw something move, just a flicker, just enough to freeze me. Tevin saw it too. He pressed a finger to his lips. We moved slower, more careful. At the halfway point, Arima collapsed. Her breath was shallow. She clutched her satchel and forced it into my hands. Inside was a small obsidian disc, warm to the touch, carved with strange symbols that shimmered faintly. She whispered that it had to reach the gate, that it would show the way. Then she closed her eyes. I didn't want to leave her, but we had no time. The sky dimmed, the wind shifted, the shadows grew longer. Tevin pulled me up the last flight. The trees opened into a plateau. There was the arch buried in vines, worn but still there. I ran to it, heart racing, holding the disc like it might crack. But something was wrong. It didn't glow, it didn't respond. Then I heard him. Not footsteps, just presence. Cold, thick, still. I turned. He stood at the tree line, taller than any man, face like bone, two sharp fangs curled at the corner of his lipless mouth. His eyes weren't eyes, just light, green, and endless. He didn't run. He glided. His cloak whispered like smoke. Tevin grabbed a stick, pointless. I knew it wouldn't help. I took a step back. The disc in my hand pulsed. He hissed. Tevin shouted something I didn't understand. The disc grew hotter. The arch shimmered. The air split. My ears rang. Then he lunged. I felt the wind of it just missed me. Tevin tackled him. I screamed. The portal lit up, white and gold. It pulled at me like gravity. I didn't want to leave Tevin, but he looked at me once, nodded. I ran through. The light disappeared. I collapsed onto cold stone. Fluorescent lights hummed above. I was back in the lab, mud on my hands, the disc still glowing. But he wasn't gone. I know because every night since, I've heard the trees whisper again. And some mornings, my bedroom window is cracked open, from the inside. I didn't go back to the lab after that day. I told the team I was sick, but I just couldn't step into that place again, not with the feeling still crawling on my skin. I left New Mexico 2 days later and flew home. My apartment in Boston felt smaller. I didn't unpack. I didn't sleep much either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, those glowing green eyes staring through the dark like they knew where I was. I tried telling my friend Mira. She's smart, grounded. She said, maybe I dreamt it, maybe it was heat stroke, but there were things I couldn't explain. The disc was still warm. I kept it hidden under my mattress. I didn't know why. I just knew I wasn't ready to throw it away. One night, I heard it hum, soft, like it was breathing. I checked the window, closed. I checked the clock, 3:12 a.m., the same hour I crossed back. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number, one message, just a single word, return. I dropped the phone. It didn't make a sound. The apartment was too still. The next day, Mira came by. She brought coffee, noticed I looked worse. I tried to talk, but my voice felt far away. She asked me if I'd been outside. I said no. She looked confused. Said she saw someone leave my building last night wearing my hoodie. I checked the door, still locked. That evening, the disc pulsed again, stronger this time. It wasn't just warm, it burned. I threw it in the closet and shut the door. Midnight came. There was a knock. 3 slow taps. I froze. My apartment has a buzzer. No one should get to my door without me letting them in. I stayed quiet. Another knock. Same rhythm. I opened the peephole. No one there. I should have turned back. I didn't. When I opened the door, there was a small woven pouch on the floor. Inside, a feather, deep red, and a note from Tevin. It just said one thing. He needs you to come back. I packed that night, booked a flight under a different name. I didn't tell anyone. When I landed, I didn't go to the city. I rented a car and drove straight into the hills. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something pulled me west. I found the river again. The same stones, the same air, but everything looked older, or maybe I was seeing it for the first time. A woman stood by the water, Young, maybe 20, dark hair and thick braids. She wore a cloak made of bark and beads. Her name was Sorrel. She said she'd been waiting, that the gate never closed properly, that it was leaking. I didn't understand, but I followed her. Through thick vines and broken trails until we reached a clearing where the sky felt too big. She said time was bending, that the Red One was no longer alone. She pointed to the disc in my hand. It wasn't glowing anymore. It was cracked. Then she looked me straight in the eyes and said he found a way through, and that I brought him. That night, I woke in a sweat, my hands shaking. The trees whispered outside my tent. And when I unzipped it, I saw 2 green lights in the forest, far off, but closer than yesterday. I didn't tell Sorrel what I saw last night. I figured she already knew. That morning, she packed herbs into small cloth bundles, tied them with blue string, and handed one to me. Said it would help me see clearly. I didn't ask what she meant. We walked for hours through thick jungle. The air was warmer than usual, dense with the smell of earth and something faintly sweet. She said we were close to the old boundary, the place where stories turned into truth. That afternoon, we met someone else, a man named Corin. His arms were covered in patterns, not tattoos, more like old markings faded by time. He looked young, but his eyes carried something older. He stared at me for a long time before nodding, said he'd been waiting too. I didn't know what made me more uneasy, the fact that they expected me, or the fact that I wasn't surprised. As night came, we made camp near the base of a stone ridge. I noticed strange etchings in the rocks, circles spiraling outward like ripples. Corin told me they were not symbols, they were maps. Maps of the threads between moments. I didn't understand, but the words settled somewhere deep. When I lay down to sleep, I kept my eyes open. The feather from the pouch rested near my hand. It moved once, like brushed by wind, but there was no wind. I sat up. In the dark, across the fire, Sorrel was awake, watching the trees. She whispered that the air had shifted. He was near. Corin stood without sound. His steps barely touched the dirt. He motioned for me to follow. We climbed the ridge, stones loose beneath our feet. My breath was shallow, but the silence was worse. At the top I saw it, a clearing perfectly round, unnatural. In the center, a structure made of pale stone and bone-white pillars. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Corin pointed to the structure, said it was called the Echo Gate, said it could bend what's been bent too far, but only if it closed from the inside. I looked at him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Then the wind returned, but wrong, cold, like breath. The trees at the edge of the clearing bowed inward, and from the dark came a shape, too tall, shoulders too wide, limbs like branches. The Red One didn't walk. He glided again, still, no sound. I felt my feet lock, my chest heavy. He wasn't looking at Corin or Sorrel, just me. Corin stepped forward, raised his hand, said something in a language I didn't recognize. The Red One stopped, tilted his head. His eyes dimmed slightly. I took the chance and moved, ran to the Echo Gate. But it didn't open. I pressed the disc to the arch. Nothing. Behind me, Corin shouted. Then silence. I turned. He was gone. The Red One stood in his place, closer now, his face more visible in the moonlight. Still no eyes, just green flame where they should be. Then he moved, not toward me, toward Cyril. I screamed. My voice cracked. The disc finally warmed, glowed. The stone began to shift. Sorrel didn't run. She walked toward him, slow, hands out. I begged her to stop. She looked back, said only one thing. We all returned somewhere. The light swallowed her and him together. The gate pulsed once, then nothing. I woke alone at the ridge's base. No signs of them, just the feather, still warm. I don't know if it's over. But at night, I still hear footsteps outside. Only 3, then silence. I returned to Boston again, but something didn't come back with me. Or maybe something came along that I didn't see. The days felt longer, stretched thin, like the light wasn't sitting right on anything. Even the shadows looked off. I went back to work, tried to pretend things were fine. My coworkers noticed I was quieter. I told them I was tired. Truth was, I kept hearing voices in corners where no one stood. Whispers that spoke in fragments, some of them in English, some in that old tongue Sorel used. Then, one afternoon, I walked past a mirror and stopped. My reflection blinked slower than I did. I laughed it off at first, but later, I watched it longer, and I swear it moved before I did. I told Mira. She came over that night, stayed with me, slept on the couch. Around 3 in the morning, she woke up to the sound of feet moving just outside the apartment. I told her not to open the door. She didn't. But the sound circled the hallway, slow, then silence. In the morning, she found a small object on my balcony. It looked like a seed, dark red, smooth, almost soft. She asked what it was. I didn't know. But when I touched it, the lights flickered. I threw it in the trash. The next night, it was back on the table. That same night, I dreamed of Corin. He stood in a fog-covered field, holding the seed. He said the Echo Gate was still open, that I never closed it. And the longer it stayed open, the more the other side would slip through. I woke with a start. The air in the room felt thicker. My ears rang faintly. The seed was gone again. For the next week, I stayed inside. I unplugged the television, blocked the mirrors, burned sage like Sorel showed me, but the feeling didn't leave. On the 6th night, I heard someone say my name, not outside, from inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the sheetrock. Nothing. Then, suddenly, a breath, close, like someone was leaning in. I stepped back. That same morning, I found a letter slid under my door. The paper felt old. The writing was curved, looping. It wasn't signed. It simply read, "The light bends near the root. Return before it feeds." That day, I packed again. This time, I didn't book a flight. I drove west, alone, slept in the car, listened to static on the radio. 3 nights in, I stopped at a motel in Arizona. The clerk, a woman named Brielle, looked at me longer than she should have. She asked if I was the girl from the cave. I didn't answer. She handed me a room key without another word. When I unlocked the door, there was something already on the desk. The disc, unbroken. The room went silent. No hum from the mini fridge. No buzz from the lights. I stood still, listened. Outside the window, just beyond the parking lot, were 2 faint green lights in the dark. Not headlights, not street lamps. They were too high, too steady. They hadn't blinked, and I wasn't sure they ever would. The morning after the motel, I left before the sun rose. I didn't see Brielle again, but the disc was still in my bag. I didn't remember packing it. The desert felt wrong, like the sky was too low. I kept checking the rearview mirror. Nothing was there, but I kept checking anyway. Somewhere near the old ridgeline, the car stalled, wouldn't start again. I stepped out into dry silence. No wind, no birds, only the ticking sound of the engine cooling. Then I noticed someone walking up the road. It wasn't fast, just steady. A woman with dark skin and thick copper jewelry. Her name was Yana. She didn't ask why I was there. She just said the gate was leaking again. Said the ground had been restless. I followed her down a trail that curved through tall grass and pale stones. She told me she had dreams of Sorel, that Sorel was alive but not fully here, that the gate didn't take people, it mirrored them. I didn't know what that meant. Yana brought me to a place I hadn't seen before, a circle of earth scorched black in the center. Around it, 7 small stones, each one humming quietly. She said the gate wanted balance, that it was never meant to hold time, only pass it. She placed the disc in the middle. It didn't glow, but the humming grew louder. I felt a pulse under my feet. Not movement. Something older. Something watching from below. That night, We stayed in a shelter carved into rock. Yana gave me a drink that tasted of mint and ash. I slept lightly, dreamt of Tevin. His hands were covered in markings, like Corin's. He said my reflection wasn't mine anymore, that something had followed me through. I woke up with my hands shaking. The sun was still low. Yana was already outside, drawing lines in the dirt. She said the gate would open again tonight. But this time, something wanted to speak. We returned to the black circle at dusk. The air shifted fast, like the night skipped forward. I stood in the center, the disc back in my hands. I didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The space around me bent. Not visually, not physically, but I could feel it, like my thoughts weren't my own. Then came the sound, not loud, a tone, like a bell struck far away. Yana stepped back, said the speaker had arrived. I turned slowly. There was no body, just a shape, darker than the night around it. Tall, still, familiar. The Red One's presence filled the space without moving, but this time, he didn't lunge. He whispered. His voice was like wind through dry grass. He said I'd been carrying a shadow that didn't belong, that something inside me had split. And until I returned what I'd taken, the breach would stay. I asked him what I took. He said time. Then he vanished. Yana walked to me slowly, her face calm. Said I had one more night to decide. The seed was back in my pocket, but it pulsed now, like a tiny heart. And in the sky above, I saw a crack form barely visible, like a thin line of light drawn across the stars. I didn't sleep the night the crack appeared. I just sat by the stone shelter, listening. The desert was too quiet. Even the bugs stopped. The seed in my pocket pulsed stronger now, in rhythm with something I couldn't name. Yana stayed beside me. She kept her eyes on the sky, tracing the thin light with her finger. She said the tear wasn't growing, but it was deep, that whatever lived between the folds of time had noticed. At dawn, a man arrived on horseback. His name was Erez. Tall, quiet, with eyes like wet stone. He said he'd come from a place beyond the dry fields, where people no longer dream without seeing. Yana trusted him. I didn't know why, but I followed. We rode for hours, until the land changed. The rocks softened. The wind picked up. It carried voices now faint, like someone whispering your name from inside a cave. Erez led us to a ridge, with markings older than language. He placed his hand on the rock, waited, then stepped back. The ridge cracked open like a door, and behind it was darkness that shimmered like water. He said it was a mirror path, that if I wanted to return what I took, I'd need to walk through it without blinking. I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer. Inside, the world felt thinner. My breath echoed louder than my steps. I saw flashes, my own face, but not mine. She moved before I did. Then I saw Sorel. Her eyes filled with stars, her mouth moving in silence. She held out her hand. I took it. Suddenly, we were back in the jungle, clearing where the first arch once stood. But everything was burning, not with fire, with light. Trees flickered like paper. The ground split and pulsed. Sorel said the gate was fracturing, that each crossing left pieces behind, that I had become one of those pieces. I turned to see Erez behind me. He looked younger here, less real. He held the seed in his palm, told me I could plant it or carry it back, but if I carried it, I'd never feel time the same again. I didn't move. Then came the wind, thick and full of voices. From within it, the Red One emerged, not chasing now, just standing. He looked smaller, his light dimmer. He pointed at the seed, then pointed at Sorel. I understood. The seed was hers, not mine. I handed it to her. As soon as her fingers closed, the ground shifted. The jungle folded inward. The shimmer cracked. I woke up in my car, parked at a gas station off Highway 9. No one was around. The disc was gone. But I still hear humming in my ears when everything else is quiet. And sometimes, in glass reflections, I still see her hand reaching out, Not to take me, just to remind me, time doesn't forget what passes through it. Only people do.